Good evening and welcome. My name's Max Jagannathan, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow with the Centre for Public Christianity, or CPX. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to CPX's 11th Richard Johnson Lecture. Now, if that's not what you're here for and your ticket says something different, that's okay, these things happen, but trust me, it's worth sticking around anyway, you're going to love it. We want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather this evening, the Camaragal people. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. For millennia, they gathered on this land, stewarding their environment skillfully, sharing stories and learning from one another, and that's exactly what we're all here to do tonight. Now, you probably noticed that we're pretty much sold out here tonight, and I'm assuming that the reason that you all came is because you knew that I'd be here doing the welcome. So thank you for that. I'm deeply humbled. It's also possible that you being here has something to do with Tim Winton, and I get that too. I grew up in Perth on WA's beaches, and I studied Tim's work in high school, and so I, like so many of you, have been entertained, touched, and moved by Tim's writing for years. We at CPX are deeply honoured that he's here with us today. CPX is a not-for-profit media company that seeks to promote a better public understanding of the Christian message. We believe that a faith-based perspective can speak meaningfully to the issues of the day, and so we write articles in mainstream newspapers, we appear on radio and television, we speak in various settings, and we produce books, documentaries, and our weekly podcast, Life and Faith. Now, you've all been given a pencil and a small notebook. They might seem a bit retro, but they're our small gift to you to mark the evening and to represent the simple joy of thinking, writing, ideas and dialogue. There's also a QR code that you'll find on the flyer that you have there, which you can use to find out more about us at CPX and what we do. We'd love to stay in touch with you beyond this evening. Thank you all again so much for being here. Welcome, and we hope you enjoy the evening.
Hello, my name is Justine Toe. Let me add my welcome to Max. Perhaps this is your first time at the Richard Johnson Lecture. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who he was. The Reverend Richard Johnson arrived on the First Fleet in 1788 as chaplain to the colony of New South Wales. Now, of course, the words chaplain and colony are two words that can provoke discomfort today for a range of reasons. But Johnson was a much-loved chaplain who is well remembered by history. He was a friend of former slave trader turned Christian convert John Newton of Amazing Grace fame, as well as the abolitionist William Wilberforce. Now, like them, Johnson believed that his personal faith could serve the public good. He served convicts and settlers alike. He baptised them, married them, buried them, even praying on the scaffold with convicts who were sentenced to death. He was also known to visit the diseased holds of ships where convicts lay sick, and that earned him the reputation of being a physician of both soul and body, as one convict wrote home. Now, Johnson was also a pioneer in education, and he established orphan care for kids roaming the streets of Sydney. His Christian mission, however, had mixed success. He tried and failed to convince the authorities to build a church, writing in 1788, "Most would rather see a tavern, a playhouse, a brothel, anything sooner than a place for public worship." So as you can see, Johnson predicted, with some accuracy, Sydney-siders' preference for the likes of Crown Casino, Sydney Opera House and King's Cross before the money moved in. Anything rather than a church. And if you're not from Sydney, I apologise for the Sydney jokes. Now, Johnson eventually built a church from his own funds at the corner of Bligh and Hunter Streets in the middle of Sydney, just opposite the entrance to the new metro station at Martin Place. But convicts burnt it down 5 years later, perhaps setting the tone for Australia's uneasy relationship with religion. Now, Johnson also had, for the time, an unusually positive attitude to Indigenous people. He adopted a young Aboriginal girl who had been left an orphan. Her name was Burong. Now, being a keen Christian, Johnson spoke to Burong of the things of God. It turns out Burong was not so keen on Johnson's Christianity because she left the family some 18 months later. But we do know that for some 5 years after that, she continued to visit the family. Now, there's something in that encounter between Johnson and Burong that captures what we want to achieve here tonight, because a gulf separates those two people. Differences of race, religion, power, and privilege. From the get-go, there was difference and difficulty between Johnson and Burong. And we know that there is nothing easy about the conversations they were having or the context in which those conversations took place. Yet at CPX, we believe difficult conversations are worth having. We are deeply committed to productive, fruitful exchange between people with very different understandings of the world. Now, in the room tonight are people of faith and people of no professed faith. That's okay. We can still elevate the conversation on matters of spiritual importance, confident that we will all benefit from that. That is what CPX is all on about, and we hope that that spirit prevails tonight. So to introduce our speaker and theme, here's my colleague Simon Smart. Please make him welcome.
Thank you, Justine, and great to see you all here. What a great night. This is going to be a fantastic evening. Welcome. You're getting lots of welcomes, but welcome. We are very excited that you are here and looking forward to the evening. Last week on Four Corners, Peter Garrett of Midnight Oil fame said that a country without its own music is a country without a soul. And that feels true of music, doesn't it? But we could also just as easily add our country's poets and storytellers and novelists, of which we have some very good ones in this country. I would argue there are none better than Tim Winton. And he, as much as any of his contemporaries, helps us to wrestle with our collective souls. 30 books in, Winton's work has been widely translated and adapted for film and television, stage and radio. He is, in many ways, part of our lives. And every new book is met with much excitement and anticipation. It certainly is in my family. And the latest, Juice, is no exception. Now, whether you first joined the party at the Bugalug's Bum Thief, or perhaps at the embrace of Cloud Street, whether it was when you gasped when you read Breath and you could smell your own fear at the vivid description of riding those huge waves, or was it just me in the book Breath, or marvelled at Winton's ability to inhabit the mind of a neglected teenage boy on the run in the shepherd's hut, you will have sensed a profundity and yet familiarity in your experience with Tim's writing. The Australianness is unapologetic, and the characters are all people we can relate to. We recognise them. They feel like us, and perhaps most powerfully in their brokenness and fallibility. There's something comforting in that our author doesn't give up on them. His affection for them is obvious. And while it is inconspicuous and often hidden such that you've got to look for it, there's a kind of grace that's present in his stories. These are often heartbreaking stories, but there's light there too, which may well be what draws us back to him, even as he remarkably keeps wrestling with challenging forms and storylines. Tim has written about landscape for many years. He has this rare ability to describe it so that you feel it and see it and perhaps smell it. In the book Island Home, he wrote this. He said, "I'm increasingly mindful of the degree to which geography, distance and weather have moulded my sensory palette, my imagination and expectations. Landscape has exerted a kind of force upon me that is every bit as geological as family." Well, Winton is a passionate defender of that landscape as family. and is these days deeply concerned about what we might be leaving behind in the inheritance. And we'll definitely hear from him on that theme tonight. And there's an urgency to Tim's voice now that makes me think of Tim as a prophetic voice, as all the best novelists are. Now, he perhaps won't like that description, as he will well know that the prophets of old weren't always welcome. Their cries were frequently ignored, or worse, they might find themselves outside the city walls meeting a grisly fate. But of course, the true prophet has a high calling and feels impelled to speak up. And wisdom and history would tell us we would do well to listen to voices such as Tim's. We were thrilled when Tim said yes to the invitation to deliver the 2024 Richard Johnson Lecture. So here he is. Please welcome Tim Winton.
Thanks, mate. Thank you for the lovely welcome. Thank you for coming. It's a great honour to be asked to give this address. And if you feel a little weird about being here, just imagine what it's like for me. Why write love poetry in a burning world? This is the question that the American poet Katie Farris asks herself. Why write love poetry in a burning world? To train myself in the midst of a burning world to offer poems of love to a burning world. Many years before, Rilke said that beauty is but the beginning of terror we're still just able to bear. Her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. Well, that's Dorothea McKellar, of course. We used to sing that at school. I guess plenty of people in the room did. It was like a hymn to our continent, a place that teetered at the edge of being terrifying, even malign, before it mercifully stayed its hand. McKellar seemed to believe that wild and woolly Australia would always pull up and come good at the last moment. And look, maybe in 1908 it still could. But that Australia doesn't exist anymore. These days, the flood that follows the drought is sadly no longer an event of deliverance and relief. It's just another cataclysm that compounds the one that came before. And when she said, "I love a sunburnt country," she really had no idea of the conflagration that lay ahead, the one that we already inhabit, the one that we're struggling to acknowledge. The poets like Farris and Rilke, they offer us language of depth and moral courage, expressions that are austere and hard-won and brimming with risk. On the other hand, sadly, McKellar's lines are strictly conventional and sentimental. They reinforce fealty to settler platitudes. And yet her song does at least remind us of something important: creaturely terror in the face of creation. Yes, it's a terror born of awe, incomprehension, gratitude and reverence. Now that fear is a fundamental human instinct, one that became critically endangered in the 20th century, even here on this continent where its roots are deepest. Australia's first peoples are bearers of ancient wisdom. Their reservoir of experience is as deep as all human existence, and from it springs one immutable principle: that human prospects are inseparable from country. That's why the honouring of creation is non-negotiable for all of us, Indigenous or not, because here, right in our midst, underfoot and in our lungs and in our blood, lies the true economy. Call it what you will. Country, creation, our natural world is the source of all sustenance, shelter, social organisation, it's the well from which all beauty springs. We have life because country is alive. We have value because creation has value. Nature is a prodigious expression of the creative, regenerative, and endlessly mysterious life force. First peoples revere this power, and they fear it. They can be pretty circumspect about describing it too, for really, how do you find words sufficient to name the heat behind the flame? What Henri Bergson referred to as the élan vital. Indigenous visionaries like David Muljarley, Big Bill Nighy and Miriam Rose Bowman, just to name three, have tried to offer this ancient wisdom to the rest of us as a gift. That's a gesture of enormous and undeserved generosity. But when it hasn't been scorned outright, this offering has been perceived as alien or incompatible, even to those of us shaped by faith traditions that echo its central principles of relationship, restraint and responsibility. Remember, the Hebrew prophet Samuel speaks of humans as being bound in the bundle of the living. The Apostle Paul saw creation groaning in travail. St. Francis, bless him, believed that nature was a sacramental expression of God's presence and love. Of course, William Blake, still the world's foremost nudist, declared that all that lives is holy. After him, the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said that our world and our very existence is a miracle. And all these ideas, they are precious. But you have to remember they were uttered by latecomers. They're only confirming a wisdom that predated theirs by over 50,000 years. And now the rejection of this grounding principle, it hasn't been just a pity, it's been a disaster. Because when we renounce our relationship to, our dependence upon, and our obligations to the systems, seasons and creatures around us, our existence becomes disordered, rootless, meaningless. We strip ourselves of virtue and health. We consign ourselves to misery and self-harm. We're left, really, blowing our noses on the map that could lead us home and save us. Our lack of humility renders us blind, and we lose touch with what Paul Tillich calls the ground of our being. And look, I'm sure that what I've learnt from Indigenous elders over the years amounts to very small potatoes in the scheme of things, but I can tell you this: it's fed my mind and it's fed my spirit, and it's reinforced my sense that the beauty, the clemency and the regenerative wonders of nature are our first and fundamental form of revelation. That is, how we imagine and experience the divine, what Karl Rahner refers to as the holy mystery of life. But there's no authentic way of encountering this vital mystery if we don't value imagination, and there's no honest way to discuss it if we're not serious about language. Sadly, late-stage capitalism is doing us no favours in this regard. Even its wealthiest beneficiaries suffer a poverty of language and imagination that's now really become a great barrier to reflection. People of faith are not immune in this regard, and even when discussing matters of the divine, we've been trained to use the degraded lexicon of consumption and showbiz. Just a silly example. I grew up with the idea that Jesus was my PJ-wearing bestie, and in my low moments, I could just call him up on the royal telephone. But as Karl Barth reminds us, one cannot speak of God by speaking of man in a loud voice. That impulse turns something immense and strange into something trite and domesticated, even banal. My generation, we learnt to revere the nation, not country. We were in awe of the ephemeral feats of cricketers not the abiding genius of our first peoples. And like our parents, we assumed that they were the primitives and we had all the answers. And so what did we fear? Well, nothing. Certainly not nature. That was just stuff, grist, matter. And matter doesn't matter until you can put a financial value on it. Did we feel the gravity of the past? No. How could we? In mid-century Australia, the past was just roadkill in the rear-view mirror. Didn't even register as an absence. It had no weight. It was not a potent force. It was not a web that connects to and dwells within the present and the future. In other words, our reality had no navel. It had no organic logic, had no material origin, and of course, no consequences. In our minds, in the cult of our endless becoming, the days ahead would just be more of the same, just shinier and better, a grand final parade of endless material progress. There was no room in this dispensation for beauty and terror. There was little curiosity about the heat behind the flame. We'd been bad students, I'm afraid, and rotten custodians. Why? Well, our mind was elsewhere, in La La Land, where there's an unholy trinity of preoccupations. Cheap nature, cheap people, and what my old hero Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. We took and took and took and took, and we forgave ourselves everything in advance. And after 150 years of settlement, we actually got worse at being here, not better. And you might ask yourself, how could that happen? How could it have gotten worse? Well, our culture became infected with toxic positivity. It's a denial of authentic emotion. It's a sunniness without illumination. It's a devotion to vacuous optimism. And it's really painful to acknowledge this, but toxic positivity's got Christian fingerprints all over it, particularly Protestant fingerprints. Some of you are old enough to remember that The Power of Positive Thinking was published in 1952 by the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale. Presented as an expression of faith, it was, in truth, a hymn to capitalist progress, which is a belief system that emphasises becoming over being. As Pankaj Mishra describes it, it's a process defined by continuous movement with no fixed direction and no terminus. Or as I less charitably call it, one big, smiley, optimistic and unreflective machine eating the world and its peoples without let up and without conscience. Norman Vincent Peale, by the way, invented the personal brand. So it's no surprise that Donald Trump should claim him as his pastor and inspiration. Part of the evil genius in social media platforms is, of course, an addictive algorithm. But the enabler of all that narcissism and misery is Peale. All beauty, no terror, no vulnerability, no failure, no suffering. It's all self-projection. It's all becoming your perfectly curated self. Now I'm old enough to remember another Norman book. It's Norman Lindsay's The Magic Pudding. And if you don't know it, it's a story about a pie that just keeps regenerating after it's eaten. It's a kid's story, apparently, but it's also an uncanny description of the way that we live on this continent in a state of magical thinking that assumes that our lands, the waters and atmosphere are not only profane, but inexhaustible. So there's nothing to venerate here but our own genius at seizure and exploitation. And nothing to fear from creation because, of course, we are its owners and masters. And the only terror that we're subject to is the fear of missing out on grasping more. But here's the thing. Our mighty, suffering continent is confounding our infantile conceptions. Our sense of mastery has been exposed as prideful delusion. The creation that we thought we'd conquered is simply refusing to comply. Our regime of capture and domestication hasn't made the world safer for us, quite the contrary. And now, adding insult to injury, we find heretics in our midst. That is, folks who don't believe that our pudding is magic after all. They seem to say that our bites and slices and gouges leave holes, that our pie is falling apart, that it might be leaving less for the poor, less for life itself. Well, they're troublesome folks, these non-believers. Obviously, they can't have read the Catechism because they see no sacred meaning in consumption. And you know, I hear a lot of public grumbling about the decline of religious observance in our day. But there's very scant acknowledgement of the dominant religion of our time and how very devout we are and devoted to this cult that sees virtue in what every other faith tradition holds as vices: selfishness, greed, contempt for the weak, and indifference to the suffering of others. And that mindset infects government at every level. We see its influence in sports, the arts, in education. Of course, it dominates the media. And, you know, it grieves me to say that it's infiltrated and co-opted many religious institutions and communities as well. You just watch the religious institutions as they continue to protect criminals and hide their assets from the victims of abuse. We all live under an imperium whose cult of idolatrous obeisance should really be intolerable, and yet we submit to it, rendering unto Caesar every aspect of our lives, including our data. Our accommodations and submissions are now so well established that we barely even feel them anymore. Now, this imperium, it may seem monolithic because it is very well established and it's reinforced daily by most of our politicians and media, but it's not unassailable. Because for all its pomp and splendour, this is a belief system built on quicksand. It's a cult of endless growth that denies or conceals its consequences. But that makes it scientifically illiterate, makes it dangerously illogical, and it also happens to be immoral. It's a decadent and vainglorious folly. As Jacques Ellul once said, man has set out at tremendous speed to go nowhere. But what we're seeing now in real time is the true cost of all this going nowhere so fast. And while our first peoples have been urging us to fear and honour creation, we've treated it with contempt. We are wounding the world. Indeed, we are crucifying it. And soon, I'm afraid that we may come to fear it in a very different way altogether. Because if we don't throw off our shackles of prideful delusion, we are doomed to live in flight and exile in our own home. And for millions, you know, this is already a reality. People are fleeing climate extremes every day. Homeless, landless, jobless. 500,000 people die every year from heat-related causes. And this figure is expected to rise exponentially. We're all trying to keep heating to 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial times. But sadly, we're still tracking towards 3 degrees, which means that on current trends and policy settings, we are sending our descendants to hell. And you can avert your gaze, you can ignore the science, you can refuse to exercise your imagination, but every one of those actions is a moral evasion and a capitulation. And I think we're better than that. We must be, and we can be, because we still have agency, practical choices, moral choices, and a very brief opportunity in which to still exercise them. Auden said that eternity is the decision now, action now, one's neighbour here. We're at a turning point in human and in global history, a prophetic moment. We can, and I pray that we will embrace it, to act with courage and faith, because love demands it of us. The love of home, the love of our children, the love and regard that we feel for our friends and neighbours, and for the families and communities who surround us and those who come after us. But also, and most importantly, for love of life itself. Just think of the ways in which that mighty force sustains us, inspires us, and binds us together in solidarity. How in our very best moments and our best deeds, we venerate that life force and collaborate in its flourishing, adding life to life, kindness upon kindness, blessing upon blessing, miracle upon miracle. Jesus of Nazareth asked his followers a pretty darn pointed question. He said, "If a hungry child asks you for bread, will you give her stones to eat?" And that question still resonates. For me, I've got to tell you, it burns. It keeps me awake at night. Because in the face of our climate emergency, it strips me bare and it confronts me with a legacy of shame on a scale that I don't know if any other humans have had to contemplate before. Will we all knowingly bequeath hot stones to the emaciated and terrified children of the future? By our actions and our many inactions, will we deny them shelter and safety? Are we really going to steal food off their plates? From his cell, not long before the Nazis murdered him, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, "The ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children." Well, our moment of truth is now. The storm is upon us. The fire front is here. But let's not forget Rilke. Beauty still dwells in our midst. Here at the perimeter of the fireground, the space that's still habitable, where life holds on, where children still breathe and play and have dreams of a future, where love persists and action is possible. All the sacred beauty of that resonates in the moment that's still available here at the edge of the terror we're still just able to bear. And when I speak of beauty, I'm not really talking about aesthetics. I'm talking about moral beauty, spiritual beauty, the beauty of contemplation, the beauty of empathy and solidarity, the beauty of courage. All of us, young or old, atheists, agnostics or believers, we possess it, we generate it, we share it, and by God we need it. And you can probably tell my spirit is bruised, which is to say I'm deeply troubled by this moment and by the many ways it's not being confronted by our representatives. The past 15 years have left me, as Bruce Cockburn sings, hanging from this high wire by the tatters of my faith, at least my faith in humans. But humans will often find their very best selves in extremis, exceeding themselves, their limits, their habits of mind. And I don't just mean the uncanny feats of strength that you hear about, like the mum who somehow lifts the tractor off her suffocating daughter. What I'm talking about are the moments in which lifelong enemies forsake their old hatreds to stand at the firefront together to defend their town and all the others in the path of the flames. Such is our unique and onerous generational opportunity to show solidarity. I think one of the most profound expressions of solidarity can be found in The Grapes of Wrath, a mere novel. It's, if you don't know it, it's Tom Joad's farewell. Tom's on the run, he's got to leave the family, and he says to his ma before he goes, he says, "You know, a fella doesn't have a soul of his own, just a little piece of a big soul, the one big soul that belongs to everybody." And he goes on to say that even while he's gone from the family, he'll be present. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, he says, I'll be there. He says he'll be there in the voices of men who are raging against oppression, in the voices of children laughing. Wherever people struggle to strive and love, Tom Joad promises to be there. And it's my hope that we will be there alongside him. Of course, Steinbeck's been out of fashion for a while now. His reputational eclipse seems to have coincided with the rise of what Hannah Arendt calls negative solidarity, the age of all against all. Sadly, it's become the logic of our economy, and it's a form of submission that we must resist. How do we do that? Well, at least starting by grounding ourselves, shaking free of the stupor we're in. One simple way of doing that is to reclaim our creaturely existence. Simone Weil said that to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognised need of the human soul. When I was 14, I couldn't have even got through that sentence without snorting, but who says evolution isn't a thing? A generation after Simone Weil, Thomas Berry said that the universe is, by definition, a single gorgeous celebratory event. He's part of a vast and diverse tradition that finds holiness, joy and healing in the natural world. And there's plenty of them. The writer of the Psalms, Francis of Assisi, the Sufi mystic Rumi, Marvin Gaye, Gurrumul. It's a very long list. I won't go right through it. We'll be here all night. But for these poets, thinkers, singers, activists, life is a miracle and a blessing. And just think about it. In all the cosmos, within such mind-bending expanses of anoxic space and dark matter, really the odds against our existence are so large as to be comical and so absurd as to be sacred. And I know atheists who'll agree on that point and Christians who won't, but even in the face of suffering and the strange, burdensome gift of knowing that I'm going to die, I still think that to have lived is a great, great privilege. The way we do that living, though, can make this privilege easy to overlook. But now and then your armour falls away and you feel it anew, the unlikely miracle of organic life. And you remember, just for a moment, that you are a creature bound to all other creatures, born of those who came before you. A genetic, emotional and moral resonance for those who come after. And in these moments of presence, you're home again, by which I mean home in the world, set in place, able to feel, smell, taste, hear elements of the big dance around you, the swirl and the sweep of the dance that you were born into. I guess that's partly what I'm talking about being rooted and grounded. And in the West, that instinctive perception is no longer central and abiding. 2 centuries of hubris have left us alienated from it. And that's a form of poverty we don't even have a metric for, because it's not something we recognise as worthy of notice. We may be materially richer than most people who've ever lived, and yet we're also sadder, more anxious and self-harming in ways that we can't even explain to ourselves. But here's the thing, we're rediscovering something, that the best things on earth are the bits that we just can't make. And I've had the great joy of watching people learn this in real time as they come, say, eye to eye with a whale, or they stand at the edge of a massive canyon, or they see the light of dawn in a spider's web in the desert. Believe me, it's something to behold. Because for a moment, these folks appear to be losing their minds. But what's happening is they're having their minds restored to them. The mighty force is just saying, hey sister, here I am. Remember me? Look what I can do. So these moments, they're homecomings. They offer us context, an opportunity to embrace humility. And this feeling of smallness and connectedness, pleasure and gratitude, that's sacred. Grounding and gratitude, they bind us, not just to the earth, but to each other. And I think anyone who's ever seen a child born understands this, and maybe those of us who watch our seeds rise from the soil. In those moments, we know that the world is alive and good, and that we are at home in it. But we need these instances to be less exceptional. They should be constantly available, and they should be communally internalised, so that those who come after us might feel them too, not as commodities, but as baseline indicators of a viable existence and as precious confirmations of the presence of goodness in the world. Providing a viable existence to others, well, that's a practical problem, but it's also a moral necessity, which is why solidarity is so vital, because the chances that a child in the next century will feel gentle sunlight against her skin and taste clean water from a running creek, or hear birdsong, or see native animals in the wild, or even live some part of the year outside of a storm shelter, that's going to depend on the degree to which we can manifest fellow feeling amongst ourselves and for her now, by which I mean solidarity with the earth and with its creatures and peoples. Fostering that solidarity, well, I admit it cuts hard against the grain, because solidarity is anathema to capitalism, especially the brutal version that we've allowed to develop and metastasize in our time. And I've got to be honest, I've got no neat answer for how we nurture all this fellow feeling. But I do know that it's not going to come from our pitiless war of all against all, nor will we find it in those who revere convention, who crave respectability, who align themselves with the powerful against the weak. So I think it's fairly safe to say it won't be a product of business as usual. For real human progress springs from empathy, vulnerability, imagination, and disruption, from language that's honest and hard-won, from metaphors and images with roots in awe and humility, and in actions that embolden courage and resistance to oppression. Actions that are audacious and even shocking. Actions and deeds that are so surprising that they draw us together and they bear us up. Thoughts, words and deeds that are not expressions of vengeance but of love. Because I'm on the side of love, for I've seen its mighty works. But I've also seen what it costs. Because you have to remember, love makes and it breaks. That's the price of commitment. Positive change requires sacrifice. That's just non-negotiable. But in our current predicament, change really is our only hope. Naomi Klein says that if we don't demand radical change, we're headed for a world of people who are searching for a home that no longer exists. What she's saying, I think, is that we will have expelled ourselves from Eden all over again. Pope Francis says that the violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is amongst the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. He says that as a matter of urgency, we need to undergo an ecological conversion. Now, don't they make an interesting pair, the Jewish atheist and the Pope of Rome? Klein says that the solution to global warming is not to fix the world, it is to fix ourselves. And I guess that's partly what I mean about surprises. Because you see, new and unlikely threads of solidarity are being formed around us right now. 30 years ago and several popes ago, Thomas Berry had some potent ideas about this ecological conversion. I guess he really did the intellectual and theological work that underpins what the Pope's now saying. Tom Berry was a priest of the Passionist order. He talked about our dependency, this is a generation ago, he talked about our dependency on fossil fuels as an addiction. Some of you here tonight will understand that addiction is a form of captivity and degradation. Tom Berry spoke of the shame that the addict feels and the force of abjection that can propel them toward recovery with all its steps and rituals of learning and confessing, taking responsibility and seeking redress on the path to dignity and good health. Returning is hard and recovery is messy. But believe me, the allies that you find on the way, they're deeply surprising. But before you hit rock bottom, there's so much denial, so many lies you tell to yourself and others. There's always someone profiting from your illness. I've seen this up very close. I've watched people emerge from addiction, and let me tell you, their courage is stupendous. It's magnificent. Some of that courage is born of shame, it's true, but most of it is the fruit of fellow feeling, the kindness of strangers, the sort of altruism that confounds capitalism and, it would seem, Richard Dawkins. Barry says that when someone's overdosed on an opiate, you find yourself walking them around, shaking them, pleading with them to stay awake while the ambulance comes, asking them to stay with you. So just think of all the voices that have been pleading with us to stay conscious, doing everything in their power to save us from sinking back into our deadly stupor. And think of how we've patronised and scorned them instead of honouring them with our attention. Because these are prophetic voices. What they are saying deserves our attention. American poet Christian Wyman says that to attend is to atone. There are a lot of people under the age of 30 who are coming together, raising their voices and placing their very bodies in the path of business as usual. And while it's true that they do enjoy the support of some older folks, like the Knitting Nanas, Grandparents for Climate Action, Sister Bridget Arthur, peace be upon her, the late Father Bob Maguire also, and more recently Senator David Pocock, these young Australians are routinely castigated by our politicians and they're vilified in the media. Now look, these young patriots, they are awkward. But isn't it interesting that we should be so enraged by them? All the banners and slogans, the blockades slowing our very important commute, all those difficult questions they ask at shareholder meetings, and of course the mortifying street theatre. But ask yourself, what else can they do? Many of them can't even vote yet. They're doing whatever they can, snatching whatever small and fleeting opportunity is available to them in a polity that shuts them out at every point, financially, politically, culturally. But their voices are prophetic. And as Simon said, we know what happens to prophets. They're shamed and they're silenced. Jeremiah, of course, dumped in a pit. John the Baptist, poor soul, he ended up on the buffet table. Bonhoeffer, of course, murdered. Gandhi murdered. Martin Luther King murdered. In our own time, Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed by his own nation for daring to peacefully resist the predatory behaviour of European oil companies, not looking at anybody in particular, Royal Dutch Shell. Prophets speak truth to power. But to the powerful and the comfortable, the truth is a threat. It must be beaten, strangled, hanged, shot, crucified in order to maintain silence. Prophets try to shake us awake, and that's all these kids are doing. They're in our faces, they're blocking our path, they're walking us old junkies around, begging us not to sink back into cosy oblivion, because they know what our stupor is doing to creation, to our home, and of course, to their future. Their very forsakenness is being ignored. And so, I'm afraid to say, is their increasing level of persecution. We see it and we walk on by. Or maybe some of us don't see it at all. Perhaps here in Sydney it's not widely known that in Perth, where I was born, a young mother who writes 3 words on a public walkway will be subject to an armed raid at 2 o'clock in the morning. She'll have a counter-terrorism unit tossing the house, pulling her kids out of bed. And her high crime, her act of terror, those dangerous words, no new gas, written in chalk. So what does this hysterically disproportionate response suggest? That the powers and the principalities are at the very least afraid of the young. They fear the prophetic voice, and they're circling the wagons to defend the powerful, to defend business as usual. Acts of state intimidation running protection for corporate interests and now becoming more commonplace. And by and large, to our great shame, we turn our heads and walk by, even those of us steeped in religious teachings that urge us to defend the weak, the oppressed and the outcast. Now, I don't know about you, but I think we're lucky to have such young people of conscience and courage, like the kids who took the government to the High Court with the help of Sister Bridget Arthur, who are the same kids actually that are trying to get a duty of care bill through Parliament with the help of Senator David Pocock. What they're trying to do is to attempt to inject some moral substance into public decisions. They're crying for justice. They're asking generations of addicts to consider the generational consequences of their habit. We should be honouring them, not scorning them. They deserve our attention and our support because, deep down, we know they're right. We're just too proud to admit that we're hooked, that we are enthralled to the pushers and the dealers. But instead of owning the shame that we feel, the rage that we should be holding against those who are profiting from our misery, we project all that onto those who are trying to save us from ourselves. You just ask any recovering addict about the compounding consequences of denial. But here's just one, and it might be something you haven't considered before. All these young people are pleading for us to pay attention to the climate emergency. They're still using peaceful means. The courts, legislation, street theatre, blockades, paint, chalk. Bless their hearts, they are still trying to remain civilised. It's all non-violent direct action. But what happens when they're forced to resort to other means? Because if we continue to scorn and persecute and intimidate and imprison them, and their hopes wither as they face the hellscape that we're consigning them to, honestly, what do you expect them to do? We know what happens to people who are systematically humiliated. It's in our news feeds 24 hours a day, every day of the week. When people are desperate, they do whatever they think is necessary. They become bitter and vengeful. They move on, believe me, from street theatre and chalk slogans, and they use violence. And if you don't see that grave possibility in our common future, then I very respectfully suggest that you might not have been paying attention to history. So I return to context, to the wisdom of our most experienced citizens and their honour for country from which so many vital ethical principles flow. A properly grounded relationship to nature is not optional, it's required. But it's also our birthright. And so is a clement planet that offers us glimpses and intimations of the divine mystery, the mighty life force that really is beyond all of our $10 words. Creation is sacred because our best achievements and our greatest dreams could only have sprung from this ground, this earth, this air, this planet. As Tom Berry said, Mars or the moon could not produce the Cathedral of Chartres or the music of Bach or the Bhagavad Gita or the countless song lines of this continent or even Bluey. He didn't say that, I said that. For these are expressions of one instance, one place, one story still unfolding. We live within and are surrounded by miracles, and we spurn these at our peril. Because ignoring them, well, it collaborates in their degradation. And in many instances, it renders these miracles extinct. And the process that it enables and enlarges is the process that's unlikely to turn our safe home into a wasteland where art will be as remote and unlikely as the idea of God. So let's face this turning point together and embrace the fearful opportunity that history presents. But to join each other at the firefront, we're going to have to shed some ballast. A lot of ideology, a lot of fixed ideas, a lot of fiercely held beliefs. Jacques Ellul said that belief is reassuring. People who live in the world of belief feel safe. On the contrary, faith is forever placing us on the razor's edge. Well, we're there now, friends. We're right on the razor's edge, on the edge of oblivion, which happens to be the edge of the possible. That's where humans really must all go eventually in order to know themselves. The moment of decision and of action. In short, we need to get off the gear. We need to put our pride aside and feel the filth of rock bottom, and to use that hard ground as a platform from which to rise and climb and leap towards health and healing, accepting the aid of those we once wouldn't have been seen dead with, to say together, no more, never again, and to press on in search of a way that doesn't poison or steal or dishonour, a way of existing on this planet and on this continent that gives life and offers it more abundantly. So spare a thought for those kids, the ones begging us to stop cooking the planet. They were born into a collective moment of crisis, and they're seeing stuff that the rest of us might not be seeing. Because when you're hungry, you see things that well-fed folks just don't. And when you're powerless and scared, you read events that don't even register as events to those who are safe and comfortable. These kids are not blinded by the weight of their investments. They're not blinkered by their hefty super and their negatively geared properties. Their faith in the twin idols of the market and technology is not quite as slavish as those of their elders. They live in hope of a respectful relationship with the earth. To them, the future is not safely abstract because they are not yet infected with toxic optimism and magical thinking. These kids know that a crime is being committed against them and that they, the victims, are going to bear the punishment. They'll be damned for the sins of others. But in their courage, they embody the beauty that Rilke speaks of, standing at the edge of the terror they can only just bear. And like Katie Farris, they keep persisting in offering poems of love to a burning world. Well, I stand with her and I stand with them, and I really hope that you'll stand with them too. Because solidarity binds us, it feeds our hope, and love empowers us to walk together with courage and with faith right on the razor's edge. Remember, Auden, eternity is the decision now, action now, one's neighbour here. Thank you.
What a beautifully eloquent and discomforting talk.
Imagine how I felt.
Well, we're going to have some questions. I've got a couple, and then we'll be getting some through the feed. And thanks for people who've been sending them through. There've been lots. We won't get through them all, but we'll give it a crack. Tim, Joy Williams, the American writer, addressing other American writers and thinking of the parlous state of the world, borrowed a phrase from Mark Twain to say, us writers, need to write with a pen that's warmed up in hell. I want you to comment on the role of the novelist in terms of persuasion and changing people's perspectives.
Yeah, look, I think we underestimate the power of art at our peril, but we don't. I think sadly we expect less and less of novels since the old days when novels really did create change, you know. But I think it's wise to be modest about, you know, what a novel can do. But it's folly to think that they don't do anything at all, and that, you know, they can't occasionally get through and shake things up. And I look back to those writers who were brave enough to, at the end of the giddy 20s, when the world economy collapsed, those people who wrote about the experience of the people who, became unemployed and destitute. And then later, in the first American climate cataclysm, the American Dust Bowl, when writers like Steinbeck were brave enough to risk opprobrium and looking uncool and maybe making mistakes, in addressing the experience of people who became homeless and landless and jobless because the landscape was just ravaged. And likewise with the rise of fascism, there were brave writers who addressed their moment. It's very tough to address because everyone's looking over their shoulder. Who's going to be? The arts world is like everyone wants to be the first person to do the second thing. And Joy Williams I think she's a wonderful writer. I wouldn't necessarily talk about the pen dipped in hell because I'm big on the love thing, but when you can feel the flames of hell in our time, I just felt the need to address the moment, and it felt like cowardice not to, and I understand why, because it's a fraught and it's what people least want to talk about and think about. But I was trying to, in the face of the science, knowing what we know, trying to make the possible world, the nightmare that we could be bequeathing to our children's children. I wanted to grapple with the idea of just making that get up and walk, so that we could experience it. Because that's what art can give us that science can't give us, and it's experience, even if it's vicarious experience. If a novel really works, the reader feels like they've lived through something, and that can knock paint off you as a reader, certainly can as a writer. Well, I still believe that art does shake people up, and I guess I'm, hopeful but not vainglorious about the possibility that there's a role might shake things up.
There's a role there, isn't it? And certainly those of us who've already read Juice, and some will be buying it tonight, be prepared. It does affect you and it stays with you, but it's one of those things that you feel it in your gut in a way that information doesn't necessarily do that. So the role there is at least putting flesh on the bones, isn't it? And putting you into the lives of people, in the story of people's lives. You really feel it. There's a sense of that. And I think you do that incredibly well in this book. In Juice, there's a moment where one of the characters said, "My mother used to tell me that when nature dies, God dies along with her." And there's this sense that once you've lost touch with the Creator as a creature, you're kind of losing something essential to your humanity. That was, I think, an important part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we have to be very careful. We have to include ourselves as nature. Yeah. We are creatures. We are expressions of the natural world. We are the flowers of the earth in a way. Some people say we're the cane toads of the earth, but and not always without cause. But if you can imagine a world where where all the natural beauty of potential and possibility is being stripped away to just bareness, and if you can imagine a world that didn't have any other people in it, I mean, the natural world and humans are expressions of the divine. So you essentially got no palate. How do you taste anything? How do you respond to mystery and wonder in a world that's just about anguish and survival without respite?
Yes, and we talked a bit about this earlier today in regard to the novel, without giving anything away in the story. But there's a kind of survival there, and not much else some of these characters. There's sort of a joy that's stripped out, no celebration.
Yeah, and I think that's such a diminished version of life as to not be, it's a misery, and I think people throughout history have always been able to endure hardship because of the presence of the natural world, and I think Tom Berry was right, and imagine, I imagine getting on a spaceship with Elon Musk anyway, but it's like, I'll be 10 minutes in looking for the ejector seat, it's just, and it's not just his politics. I mean, the guy's goofy. He'd just be giggling around and oh no, I'm out of here. It's a surf trip that went badly wrong, But, the idea that people are going to go and inhabit and colonise Mars really is offering the most miserable prospects to a future species. And the reason that they're all excited about going there is because they're already convinced that everything's hopeless here, and their conviction about the hopelessness is increasing hopelessness. Right. I mean, that form of corporate nihilism is evil.
Yeah. Well, I love that you, while painting a very serious picture, somehow, and it's a bit like all your stories, somehow you're holding on to as you said, the kind of solidarity and the potentiality of that. Yeah. Let's jump into some of these questions from the audience.
Oh dear, okay, right.
You going for this? Tim doesn't do questions, by the way. We're very, blessed to have him do this for us tonight, so thank you. We won't regret it.
I love the assurance.
I promise. Okay.
Whence does this confidence spring?
It's an Elon Musk confidence. Okay, so talking about markets and industrialisation, you've talked about the most rapacious elements of industrialisation, and capitalism particularly. But how can you reconcile the benefits of industrialisation, like modern medicine and technology, alongside the harms that you've presented? Like, how do you weigh those, I guess?
Oh, there's no question that scientific progress and enlightenment has, taken us forward, but and there's no question that some people's safety and comfort and lifespans have expanded. But I think we make a mistake in assuming that it's universal, and it's simply not. And it's in my lifetime, the gap between, or the distance between universality, the shortfall is so enormous. The gap between the rich and the poor. A great deal of our industrial progress in the last 200 years has been at the expense of poorer peoples. It's built on colonialism. It's built on cheap nature and cheap people. And if you wind that back in terms of the cost, if there was a ledger, I don't know if it really comes out looking that great. So, I mean, to be a creature, to be alive is consequential. Even if you're a plant eater, you're eating life in order to live. I understand that. There's no free pass. Everything is consequential. But I think the way that we have lived in our time has been, we are able to live the way we are because we are able to block our minds to the consequences, to everything that's weaker than us. And that includes, as the Pope says, the natural world and the poor.
I'm going to resist the temptation to, which is what I do have, which is to keep talking about that each question, but we won't get through it.
But you've got one about the Bugalug's bum thief, I hope.
Yeah, we'll get to that towards the end. So here's a question. I've heard you refer to whale sharks you've swum next to in Ningaloo Reef as your neighbours and fellow creatures. Would you like to say more about this, if someone says? I'd hear a bit of that.
Well, I guess I have learnt, how interdependent and interrelated we are, and that we have this very exclusive notion of ourselves as if we are the only species that is sociable, that is intelligent, that and that matters, of course. But I really have been privileged to, see how curious many animals are, and how they are capable of altruism, that they, not all of them, and they are capable of savagery. And, because everyone has this very pretty romantic idea of dolphins, but you've just never seen them at work,
Oh, don't ruin my idea.
No,
I still think when
they're pack rapists. I mean, it's awful. They're like bikers,
Really?
But so it's not all. But there is a great there's a great joy in realising that your interconnection. And even if you don't know the science, just the levels of interplay. And even a whale shark, which is an enormous animal, but not that big of brain. There are fish that are smarter than a whale shark, but they are, they do register your presence, and they are, curious about you, and not as curious as a whale, obviously, because a whale's quite smart, and a whale's trying to figure out, when you're in a boat and they're spy hopping, it's called, they pop up and lean into the boat. They're trying to figure out which bit of this mass is a thing and which is a creature. And they're really curious about that. When they figure out the distinction between the moving bits, a creature like them, they get quite excited, It's been a long, journey of discovery and unlearning in that sense.
Yeah, a lot of us have seen you swimming with the whale sharks. And someone asked here, where you have most experienced awe. I wondered if there was that connection.
Oh, I've seen a lot of babies born.
Yeah, you have now, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. It's like, honestly, how can this happen? It's remarkable. But there are just many really low-key sources of awe and wonder, and I think we've got bad at registering them. I think we're also not even good at recognising our yearning for it always anymore. And it's that stuff that charges your batteries. I mean, I my faith in people is increased by the nourishment I get from non-people, if you know what I mean. And because people ask me, we're doing a lot of stuff about climate, and people talking about how do you fight back against despair, and the natural world is a balm, even in its savagery and its harshness. It just charges me up, And maybe I'm just a simple bloke, a bit of salt water over the gills, and I'm a new old bloke, I feel great. I feel hope in the natural world. I'm convinced that the world is good, and people are good. I don't think we are depraved, and I think people want to be good and do good and see good done, and they feel good when they do something right. They do something selfless.
Yes, and although it's sort of a hard message to sell, but people capturing that vision, once they do, it can be pretty powerful. One of the questions here relates to this, where they said, how do I experience awe when I'm stuck in mostly dealing with technology and in an office and rarely getting out into the natural world?
Yeah, I think if we allowed ourselves to believe that was a form of captivity that we had no choice about, then we're probably kidding ourselves a bit. I mean, it's obviously easier for me to say, all this stuff about, jumping in with megafauna. But if you're working...
It's a bit easier where you live.
When it's not as if you were born in the office and you die in the office and you sleep in the office.
Some of us do.
And you mate in the office and you give birth in the office, But some of this feeling is, I suspect, is partly to do with the degree to which we've given over our lives to work. And technology, which was supposed to have liberated us from labour, from drudgery, has got us working harder than we ever have. Yeah. And our children are indentured to that labour by supplying their data to what, Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism. Right from their first starter phone is essentially bleeding them of their data and their lives to monetize, their existence. I mean, so it is voluntary, this stuff. It's not as if, particularly in a country like Australia, we have access to the natural world and to simple, beautiful things the way that a few other people have. But I completely sympathise. I was stuck in traffic the other day in that big praying horrible disaster on the bridge, and for a couple of hours there, it's pretty hard to feel or anything but irritated.
And you didn't get your best Sydney afternoon that day, I hate to say it, but and your description of Sydney in Juice wasn't very endearing, I'd have to say.
Oh, it was sort of oblique.
If you get to that reference, you'll know what I'm talking about. We'll be trying to forgive you for that. And that was not.
What was it Paul Keating said? If you're not in Sydney, you're camping out.
That's right. In Juice, in the wasteland you create, you refer to the cataclysm of absence, not the horrors of what's happening, but all the things that can't happen because the climate calamity has forced everyone to retreat underground for much of the year. And the question is, I wonder whether the lockdowns of COVID inspired that terrifying thought at all.
No, well, again, I have to own my privilege in this regard because because Mark McGowan, I suppose, we lived. Our experience of COVID was sort of an aristocratic experience, and so I'm a bit sheepish about that. But it was interesting the way it put us into a different mindset. It is interesting that how implacable the world and the system is until suddenly it's not. And this is something that we have to bear in mind. We're in this way of living and a way of doing business and a way of organising ourselves which seems immutable, and then it's just suddenly not. In the same way that socialism and redistribution of wealth and going into deficits for the greater good is just anathema until COVID, and then suddenly everyone's a socialist.
That did happen
the Liberal
quickly,
Party,
didn't it? Yeah.
Big thumbs up.
That was
deficit. What deficit?
That was the sort of conversion experience you're talking about. Okay, we've got to get through a couple more here. The problem here is that these move, and then I've lost.
Oh, right. Okay.
I think this question said that a lot of what you're describing comes from the desire for more time, more things, more progress. And the question was, to what extent do you think the Christian story, which has a lot about self-sacrifice and denial of self in the service of others, could play a role in some of what you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the resonant parable, that stuck with me since I was a kid. The story of the Good Samaritan, the person who crosses tribal lines to give aid when everyone else is walking past. I mean. And the trouble we have is, in our tradition, we get buried in theology. I mean, really, that's the nub, isn't it? And I think it's that instinct to add life, to join, to not see the label, to not see and also to reach beyond hostility, to try to break through. And I mean, that's what the book is trying to do. You know, it's a guy telling a story, the story of his life to a stranger, not just to save his life, which is definitely what's happening, but he's trying to break through to someone who's suspicious and hostile, to find the light in them, to find the decency in them, to make an enemy into a comrade. And I mean, that's a Christian instinct. It's not exclusively a Christian instinct, but it's our strength as a tradition. You know, I mean, you know, Bonhoeffer really is my life hero, and he said, I mean, this part doesn't always get quoted. He said that it's not just our duty to bind the wounds of those who are crushed under the wheel of oppression, but it is to drive a spoke into that wheel. And I find that confronting but also consoling, you know, in a sense of it charges me up.
Yeah, it's interesting the way Bonhoeffer is hijacked by different people.
Yeah, I mean, his most recent biographer is a crazy right-wing Trump conspiracy theorist. You know, it was like looking him up on YouTube. It was like, wow, had no idea.
Well, yeah, I'll leave that one. Okay, so two more.
But also, it's very confronting for me because I'm a pacifist, right?
Yeah.
And I'm a religious pacifist. But so is he. Until something so big came along that, you know, he became one of the conspirators who tried to take out Hitler, you know, and paid for it. And also they waited until the very last minute when they knew they'd lost the war, and it was like nearly time, we'll hang him, now the war's over. Just the bastardry of that, you know.
Yeah. And there's another line of his that he says, which isn't usually on the church notice board, but it is when Jesus calls you, he calls you to come and die. And the whole thing is, you know, active sacrifice, service of others.
Yeah.
And he certainly lived that out, didn't he, to the end. So two more, Tim, because we'll have to stop it there. But there's a question here that's in red, so I think it's an urgent one. But more than, and I shouldn't, it's important too, though. So it is a good one. More than 80% of young Australians experience a degree of climate anxiety. And I think, according to some research from Curtin University, so I think, you know, we think of people here tonight who will be feeling that. Do you have thoughts for them? Because you're painting a pretty dramatic and importantly dramatic picture, but what word would you have for them?
Well, I think we should, I mean, it's a good question, and thank you for it. I mean, I think we should take it seriously. And I think, you know, Christian Wyman's words resonate, you know. To attend, i.e. to pay attention and to listen, is to atone in a sense. I mean, if you take their anxiety seriously, that means you're prepared to do something about alleviating it, and not by giving them false consolation, by putting yourself in the service of their care. And that means trying to change the world and the system to make sure that their fears, which are well grounded, because young people are feeling it because they're more literate about it, and also they are, you know, they're the ones that are really going to cop it in a way that will be prevented by, you know, from experiencing some of it. So I think to take it seriously and to commit yourself to action, to join with them, to bear them up, to help them out. However you can, you know, and yeah, I'm really conscious of it. I'm getting mail from and I'm meeting on this tour, you know, the parents and the grandparents of young people who are experiencing it, and also young people who are up on charges for trying to do something about it. People hearing, you know, there are people in prison in the UK for crimes against perspex. There's somebody in Perth up on charges of crimes against perspex, you know, eccentric parking, attachment issues, you know, and they need our support.
Tim, last year's Richard Johnson lecture was on hope. I want to ask you about hope to finish. Where do you find the resources for hopefulness in the face of the real predicament you've been talking about?
I think years ago I just shared the idea of hope as an emotion. I think hope is discipline. Hope is something that you take on, that you gird yourself with, and it needs to be recharged, and I get that from other people, and I get that from, as I said earlier, looking into the faces of my kids and my grandkids, and when you've got really small people in your life, especially when you see them born in their pure, unblemished faces, and you want, like as any parent or any grandparent or even any onlooker and auntie or uncle, you want the best for them, but you see the best in them as well. This is a flower. This is another miracle. So that's where I draw my hope, because this has been given to us, and I guess my hope is more like a form of determination than a feeling of optimism.
Yes.
And simply it's a refusal to submit. Beckett doesn't always get quoted in a theological context, but think of Godot. I can't go on. I'll go on. But we never go on alone. We always have to go on together. Yeah. That's the only way we can go.
And it's like love, isn't it? It's a choice to sort of...
Yeah, no, and it needs to be fed. But it also needs, you need to be receptive to be fed by others.
Well, Tim, the whole evening's been amazing. We're so grateful for you being here.
Well, thanks for being crazy enough to ask me.
I'm glad we did. And I've got a couple of things to say here before we completely wrap up. So okay. just pause for a moment on that. But I want to just mention a couple of things as we finish. We'd love you to connect with Centre for Public Christianity, or CPX, if you haven't already. We make all our content available for free. You can get that at publicchristianity.org. We have a weekly newsletter that you could sign up for. We will be releasing tonight's lecture down the track, and if you're on that newsletter, you'll be alerted to when that will be, so that'll be a good motivation for you to do that. You can also listen to previous Richard Johnson lectures. We've got 10 previous ones. We have a podcast for that. We also have a weekly podcast called Life and Faith that was mentioned earlier. We've got over 500 episodes of that. And Tim appears on at least 3 of them, and one coming up in a couple of weeks where he'll be talking about juice. So again, commend that to you. We produce books and documentaries, and you can find some of that material in the foyer on your way out. I'd love you to check it out. You can also find us at X and Facebook and Instagram, unsurprisingly. And we'd, again, be great if you could connect with us in that way. Tim is going to be in the foyer for a while, signing some books, the new novel, Juice. So if I'd recommend you don't miss the chance to get the book and to get it signed. And Tim's been generous enough to do that. It's been wonderful to have you in town. I know you're in the middle of a massive book tour, Tim, and to have a gap in that where you didn't get a night off. We've got to do this. It's a huge privilege for us, and we thank you so much. Please, will you join me in thanking you? Thank you.